Next up is Leatherface. I have only ever seen the original Texas Chainsaw and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, both of which are great for kind of polarizingly different reasons. Leatherface, which is a prequel to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was kind of a pleasant surprise. I found myself actually really enjoying this movie. Lily Taylor gives a good performance as Leatherface's mother, and you kind of get to see where he comes from. There's sort of a twist in this in which, there's a character that's established who you expect to be Leatherface, and then it turns out it's actually this relatively well-balanced guy who goes crazy by the end of the movie due to all the terrible things that are done to him. But it's almost too obvious, so you kind of see it coming, but it's still well executed, so I appreciated the effort. It has some good gore in it, it's got some interesting characters, and overall pretty solid, which is actually a through line through all the Texas Chainsaw sequels. I was kind of expecting these movies to all be terrible, except for the ones by Tobe Hooper, but I actually found some enjoyment in pretty much all of them. But either way, of the horror series that I marathoned this year, Texas Chainsaw was up there for the ones that I watched, so this was a solid start to that marathon. Now, jumping ahead, there's another Texas Chainsaw movie called Leatherface, and that is Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, Leatherface. And similar to the other Leatherface, I was really expecting this to be kind of a terrible movie, but I actually found the first half of this in particular to be really, really good. It's kind of similar to Breakdown, where you have this couple that's driving through an unfamiliar area, they don't know the locals, they're just passing through, and they get terrorized after they break down on the road, and there's this whole plot for them to break down on the road. It's actually very similar to the plot of Breakdown. And maybe that's just a phobia that I have, because I found the first half of this movie to be surprisingly gripping, even though it doesn't necessarily read your typical Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Once you get to the last half, things get kind of ridiculous. You've got the saw where, it says the Saw is family on it, and it becomes basically kind of a crappy Texas Chainsaw sequel that you would expect. But even so, the characters are well realized. Viggo Mortensen is in this, and he gives actually a pretty good performance. So I found Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, despite being probably one of the lower regarded films in the franchise, to be quite good. I really liked it. As I mentioned in a previous video, I did watch The Keep this year on Laserdisc, where it is locked away because of rights issues. I talked about liking The Keep in that video and kind of what I liked about it. As I've sat with it, I think I've actually appreciated it more and more. Still not the best movie ever, but pretty interesting, and I'm going to be reading the books. But if you want my full thoughts on The Keep, be sure to check out my last movie rewind where I talk about horror laser discs. Otherwise, I'll just say here, strong recommend. Next up, I actually almost forgot Malignant, which I don't have because it's only in theaters. I watched it on HBO Max, and this is another one that's been kind of divisive. People either love it or they hate it, and I'm going to say I loved it. So if you haven't seen Malignant, I really highly recommend it. It was in the top 3 among The Invisible Man and Deep Red of the new movies I saw this year. Malignant is absolutely top of the list, in the top 3 for sure. And the reality is they just don't make movies like this anymore. It's funny because it's hard to know what the filmmakers were thinking. This is James Wan, who's done The Conjuring. He did Saw. He knows how to manipulate an audience, draw great characters. And this is just like pure schlock territory. Because this is a newer movie, I'm not going to spoil what happens. But this movie has some crazy twists that aren't surprising in a clever way. They're surprising because you can't believe that the filmmakers went there. It's a movie that has a lot in common with like Frank Henenlotter, which if you hear James Wan talk about it, he compares it to like Giallo films, and there is like an element of that to it, but I would say that's like very loose. It's much more connected to like Frank Henenlotter's Basket Case, for example, or Brain Damage. which those are among my favorite horror movies. Like I really like Frank Henloter's movies. I own all of them. Seeing this and like the concept of it was delightful. The characters aren't particularly well done and like the dialogue is extremely clunky. But that kind of adds to the charm of it for me because it brings it into that B movie Frank Henloter territory, but with this A-list big budget Hollywood horror veneer over the top of it. It just made for a really, really bizarre experience that I really enjoyed. Definitely, of the movies that came out in 2021, definitely one of my favorite horror movies that I watched over the Halloween marathon, if not one of my favorite movies of 2021. And next we get Manhunter. So this is one of those perils of doing this in alphabetical order instead of order by series, because I started talking about the Texas Chainsaw series, and then now we're bouncing back to another series that I talked about, which is the Hannibal Lecter series. Now, obviously, this is not part of the traditional. This is not part of what we think of as the traditional Hannibal Lecter series with Anthony Hopkins. In this, Brian Cox plays Hannibal Lecter. Although this still has a lot of ties to that series, because this is produced by Dino De Laurentiis, who produced all of the films after Silence of the Lambs, which I don't think he produced that one, or at least he wasn't as heavily involved as he was in the later sequels to Silence of the Lambs. And it also has a brief appearance from Frankie Faison, who goes on to play the orderly that works at Hannibal Lecter's hospital in all the Anthony Hopkins movies. So some interesting parallels, although very different stylistically. I almost don't even consider this a horror film. It's almost more of a police procedural in the spirit of like a CSI. This is directed by Michael Mann, who directed The Keep, and is much more in his typical wheelhouse because they really play up the detective aspect. It has a soundtrack that's very much in the spirit of 80s Michael Mann films. And so it really is ultimately a very unique film in the Hannibal Lecter franchise. That said, I won't say this is my favorite. Like, a lot of people hold this up as like the pinnacle. I mean, I'm sorry, you're just not going to convince me that this is better than Silence of the Lambs. But maybe it's one of those things where like it kind of depends on which one you saw first. And if you saw Manhunter back in the day when it was new and there was no Silence of the Lambs, I could understand where you were disappointed that it didn't continue in that thread. For me, I mean, there's a reason Silence of the Lambs is a classic. That I just am not really arguing with because it's what I grew up with. So I didn't see Manhunter until I was in high school, and it was fun to go back and revisit it, even though it didn't really change my opinion of it, which is it's definitely a good movie, but not necessarily what I'm looking for when I'm watching something that is a Hannibal Lecter or a slasher or serial killer type movie. Okay, next up, we have what at the time was the follow-up to Castle of the Creeping Flesh, which we talked about kind of a while ago now. And that is Mark of the Devil, Adrian Hoven's other production that I alluded to way back when I was talking about the movies in the seas. This is a much, much better movie, in my opinion. It's all about witchcraft and dealing with how people were treated in Germany. Despite the fact that this film doesn't have an actual organ transplant in the middle of the movie, the gore in this is actually quite frightening. It's interesting how there's a difference there where like the fake gore is somehow more gruesome than literal gore you're seeing on film. But I think it's because of the context, because all the gore in this is very contextual, it's very real and very visceral, because it all relates to torture and things people actually did to women when they were investigating witches. So not only is this film very effective, it has an excellent ending that is pretty haunting. And similar to The Invisible Man, you feel super frustrated by what these characters have to go through and how it just keeps getting worse and worse for them. You get a fantastic performance from Udo Kier, who is the youngest I've ever seen him in a movie, and then Herbert Lom, who plays the adjudicator. Definitely one of my top choices this year for movies I watched. All right, next up we have a whole marathon, a whole series of movies that I watched. This was all done in one day. I went through the Prophecy movies starring Christopher Walken. I was pretty excited to dig into these, and very, very quickly became disappointed. So I'll just kind of go through all these fairly quickly. The first one is quintessential 90s. Seemed like a lot of movies from the 90s that dealt with the Bible and how kind of horrific things in the Bible actually are has this whole veneer of like, can you believe this is in the Bible? Can you believe that is in the Bible? And it's like, yeah, I'm aware. It's just like this whole re-examination of faith that happened in the 90s that I felt like largely went nowhere. And now when you watch these movies, it just sticks out like a sore thumb as very heavy-handed. But surprisingly, the first of the prophecy movies actually ended up being one of the worst ones. And as it went along, I found myself enjoying them more and more. And again, none of these movies were great, but they were okay. The Prophecy 2 plays a little bit more like a traditional horror film in which Christopher Walken is a little bit closer to the Jason archetype, although certainly the plot's more complex than something like that, but it just fits that mold a little bit better, so it was just a little bit more satisfying than the convolutedness of the first one. And then by the time you get to 3, I actually kind of enjoyed it. At the end of 2, Christopher Walken has his powers taken away. He's supposed to be the Archangel Gabriel, by the way, and so he loses his wings and is cast down to Earth, and then he kind of has this redemptive arc in 3 where he just plays it completely over the top and absurdly. And then in 4 and 5, I'm pretty sure these are all like direct-to-video ones, but this is kind of like a mystery plot that takes place in like Czechoslovakia. And while it's not particularly good, it was just mildly B-movie entertaining. And then the 5th one, Prophecy Forsaken, picks up right where that one left off. Not as good as the 4th one, but still better than several of the ones that preceded it. This is one of the few franchises where the further you get into it, the more you actually find yourself enjoying it because it loses some of those 90s cliches and just kind of starts doing its own thing. All right, so that brings us to the R's, guys, and I'm getting through these as fast as I can. I'm taking a little bit longer than I intended, but thanks for sticking with it. Kicking off the R's, we have the last Bill Rebane film for the October Marathon. This one fits pretty solidly into the Rubber Monsters category, and that is Rana, Legend of Shadow Lake, aka Croaked. This is the Trauma DVD release of it. They have yet to put out like a really solid version of this movie, but I had never seen this one. This one was new to me, so I was really excited to give it a watch. It was okay. It wasn't my favorite. I think of all of the ones I watched this year, it was probably my least favorite of the Bill Rebanes, but it had that 70s Bill Rebane charm, the low-budget filmmaking. Basically, a bunch of people go to an island that's cursed with this ancient frog deity. So makes for a fun watch, even though it's not my favorite Bill Rebane. It's solidly in his 70s film catalog, which for me is less favorable than his 80s film catalog, but still definitely worth a watch. The only Bill Rebane movie now that I haven't seen is his Abominable Snowman one, which I just have yet to find. I know that it's available in like a DVD multi-pack. I just would ideally like to get it on its own so it can sit with the rest of the Bill Rebane movies on my shelf. Next one you probably knew was coming is Red Dragon with Anthony Hopkins. This is one of those movies where it's fine, it doesn't blow me away, but it's somewhat satisfying. It fits pretty squarely into the Silence of the Lambs mold, but is much more by the numbers, cookie cutter, mystery serial killer film. I don't think that this is better than Manhunter, although I probably rewatch this one more than I do that one. The big thing that struck me when I was watching it this time was watching the extras, because there's a whole hour-long documentary about Brett Ratner in this, in which he comes off really creepy now that we know what we know about Brett Ratner and how he treats women on set. So that was a little off-putting, but at the end of the day, I have to separate the artist from the art, and I think Red Dragon's pretty good, even if it's not as good as Manhunter. It's still a fun watch. All right, moving on to the S's, I watched Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. This was the last movie I watched in my horror marathon. I watched it right before midnight on October 31st, just a few hours before recording this video. I enjoyed this movie a lot. I thought it was going to be more of an anthology horror film. I wasn't expecting it to be actually have a plot in which the scary stories to tell in the dark are just things happening to each of the characters as it goes along. In some ways, this movie reminded me of the first It, just in the sense that, it takes place in 1968 instead of the 50s, but it's still kind of a period story, and it tells the story of these teenagers who are trying to unravel the mystery. I would say this is a much better movie than It overall. I know, blasphemy for people who love the movie It, but I don't love it. I don't love either of them, or any of them, because like the Tim Curry one, I guess I grew up with it, but I don't have a huge amount of nostalgia for it. But point being, this kind of has a similar formula, but it's a lot scarier because it's not just, boo, clowns are scary. It's got a bunch of kind of creepy, visceral, scary stories that would be told in the dark, all of which are really unique and creative. And this is produced by Guillermo del Toro, so it's got great monsters in it. All in all, a great movie. I wish I had gotten to see this one in the theater. All right, next up, last alphabetically of the Hannibal movies, although third in terms of the timeline and second in terms of order that they were made, we've got Silence of the Lambs. I picked up the Criterion version of this when it came out, and I haven't watched it. I actually unwrapped the shrink wrap to do this marathon. It was one of the reasons I wanted to go through and do all these this year. There's nothing I can say about this movie that hasn't already been said, so I won't dwell on it. I'll just simply say Silence of the Lambs, to me, completely holds up as a masterpiece of horror. It came up multiple times when I was talking with people about horror movies, just off the cuff. They were talking about how much they liked it, and they were people that don't even watch movies, really, but they still called out Silence of the Lambs as a movie they were going to watch this holiday. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Just a movie that totally deserves the praise that people heap upon it. Okay, back to movies I haven't seen. This one being one in the Rubber Monster category. I finally watched Spookies. I don't know if you guys have seen Spookies or not. I'm not sure how many people have actually seen Spookies, but it's one of those that's sort of considered so bad it's good. I don't know. It was interesting. So, the thing that this movie's famous for is the swamp monsters that come out of the ground and can't stop farting, which when I got to that part in the movie, I'd kind of forgotten about that. And so as I was watching it, it like took a second to process that they were farting, and then I couldn't stop laughing, much to the cringe of the filmmakers of this movie, who didn't want them to be farting. That was something like the producer did after he took control of the movie. All in all, this, to me, other than the farting monsters, this movie really isn't that like laughably bad. It's bad, and the actors are not good, but it's also like not so bad it's funny. It's more just bad. However, it does have, actually, in my opinion, really good creature effects. So it's kind of this odd movie where it like kind of fits into no category. Whether it's actually good horror film or actually bad or so bad it's funny, like it sort of straddles all of those lines. In some ways it's good, in some ways it's terrible, and in some ways it's funny. The most interesting thing about this is learning about the movie and the making of it after the fact, because basically what happened was the founder of Vipco, who put out VHS in Great Britain in the 80s, basically funded this movie for a couple of filmmakers that wanted to get into making movies. They were good at doing creature effects, which is why the creature effects in this are pretty solid. And after they were done making the movie, he took it away from them, refilmed half of it, re-edited it, and made a huge mess out of it. Now, in the extras, you get two documentaries. You get one from the perspective of the filmmakers and one from the perspective of Vipco and the producer. So you get two completely different sides of sort of what makes this movie cult. You get the 80s video nasty VHS recap when you talk about Vipco and how Spookies kind of fit into that. And then you get this story of, the oppressed filmmakers that wanted to do one thing and didn't get to do it, and kind of all their hopes and dreams were kind of stolen away from them. What I came away from after watching those documentaries was, at the end of the day, I don't think these were actually that great of filmmakers, because even though half the movie is theirs, the performances are cringe, the plot is underbaked. Obviously they can't defend themselves because their movie, they could prove it with their movie if they could make it, which they can't. But I'm skeptical that this movie really would have turned out. Not that I'm siding with Vipco and them taking the movie over and, completely messing with their art. Like, I wish they could have finished the movie for sure, and I would side with them on principle. But that said, I think that if they had made the movie they wanted to make, I'm not saying that that would have been the masterpiece that I think they think that it would have been. But I certainly would have liked to have seen it. I don't hate the producer at Vipco that stole everything away. I mean, he's a total con artist. You can tell in the documentary about him. But nonetheless, like, he's one of many, 80s VHS boomers that were just a reality of filmmaking at the time.